Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Spin Legal today, Wednesday, July 10th. And today we're kind of following on the discussion that we had this morning on Talking Niagara about um, uh, about disability and the law. This morning we were talking about problems that people were having with disability, arising out of disability. So we thought we'd continue, and thank you for Mike Cushman and the discussion we had on Talking Niagara. And now we're continuing to Spin Legal, looking more at some of the legal aspects of disability law. Hey, Angela, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. You're low volume a little bit. Can you uh, speak up the camera a little bit closer?
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Okay. All
Is
right.
that better?
I don't know what that is. Maybe it's just my end. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Let's just okay. So if you need to contact Invictus Legal, just get the sales blurb out the way. You can do so on 905-688-5598. You can email Angela at angela@weareinvictus.legal, me at peter@weareinvictus.legal, and our website is https://weareinvictus.legal. There you go.
Yeah. And periodically now again, we would be contributing articles. So come visit our website now and again. You'll find different things that are interesting.
And also go check Facebook, our
Facebook
Facebook
too.
page.
Our
Yeah,
Invictus Facebook, which is the page you might be watching this on, and as
likely. Yeah.
well, yeah. And then you have that, and we're setting up our LinkedIn page to also follow through on some of the stuff because some of the discussions may vary, depending on the type of audience that we're looking at on each of the forums.
Okay. I think we talked briefly about this subject before, but we're looking a bit more in depth at it. And this morning we were talking about disability problems of people being, disabled out of work, or how we treat disabled people. So we wanted to look at some of the legal aspects of disability. So the question that we have really is, what rights exist for peoples with disabilities? Um, and I forgot to put a question mark on there. So there we go. Here we go.
There we go. All
Okay,
right.
so that's an interest. There's quite a few areas that do exist in that. When it comes down to it, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the start point for looking at what rights exist for disabled people.
hmm The Charter
Right?
of Rights and Freedoms under Section 15A says that people with disabilities are equal before and under the law, and and then they also have a justification for programs where people with disabilities are favored where there was an amelioration in the past where there was issues. So basically the problem that is that although it says so and the charter has it, the charter has yet to be enforced in these areas where people with disabilities have it, and the other area is Canada Human Rights Act
Well,
where
so you're telling me that there's no case law about disability rights in relation to Section 15?
there's lots, okay?
Oh,
But the problem is, it's what they call negative rights. Okay? There's something called negative rights and there's something called positive rights. A negative right is something that you can't have something done to you because you're disabled. Okay? Like you can't be forcibly confined, for example, in an institution just because you're disabled.
but
Okay?
again, isn't that true for most of the parts of the charter, Section 15 of the charter? You can't be you can't be discriminated against on the basis of color, or on the basis of ethnic origin, or on the basis of
That's true too.
nationality.
But when you're talking about people with disabilities, they don't have equality. They don't have equal marriage. They don't have rights of mobility. They don't have rights of earning an income, especially if they're on a fixed income because of disability income. And they can't really make as much as they want to get out of poverty. And they seem to have like a boot over their head about how to control their life as opposed to how other people would in the same situation, except they're not on assistance, have to deal with. So
Okay.
I mean, this is where there's too much differences. They have to have, it has to be gotten rid of in terms of the differences. Then
Okay.
you'll see more and more people with disabilities working, because this is the same argument that's been put forward by basic income and the basic income movement. If you gave people a basic income that was unconditional, that was sufficient to live on if the person had to have it, and
You
people,
mean somewhat like CERB
yeah,
during
something like that.
COVID? Yeah.
Yeah, and people could work if they can, and that they can do that. But what they were doing with people with disabilities is ODSP wants to know everything. Is your family giving you money? Are you living with somebody who's should be supporting you? Are
Well,
you? Do your children live with you, or do your children work? Maybe they should be supporting you. That sort of thing has to go, because what that does, it removes the dignity from people with disabilities.
yeah.
They don't have that equal right. Like, say, if any normal person who is not disabled, I mean, a non disabled person who goes to work and say they earn $60,000 a year, and they meet another partner who's also non disabled, but they make $40,000 a year, and they decide, okay, let's live together. Their combined family income is $100,000 a year. But if the $40,000 a year person meets somebody who is on ODSP who gets, say, $20,000 a year, it's not 40 plus 20. It ends up 40,000 for that whole family,
Yeah.
because the
Okay.
20,000 is taken away from them.
Okay. All right. We'll get on to that in a little while.
Yeah,
So just so that anybody says so, we've got a government website here that actually puts out the information, and it's at this location here. Look in the comments down beneath if you want to go visit that government website about rights for people with disabilities. All right. So
yeah. There's a
that's
lot of resources to
yeah,
look up,
there's a lot of that's one of the many resources that we do have out
including
there.
the international
So,
charter that Canada signed and ratified. But whether we follow it or not is another story.
but that's why people like you and I are here. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's move on to the next step of this one, Canadian Human Rights Act. How does that impact, and how does that protect Canadians with disabilities from discrimination?
Basically, everything that's under federal jurisdiction goes under the Canada Human Rights Act. Whether it's like employment, whether it's accessibility, whether it's accommodations, whether it's a service that's being provided or not provided. There's a number of things that are being proposed under Canadian Human Rights Act. So if it's a federal jurisdiction issue, they fall under that. They
Would
cannot.
that mean okay? So with a federal jurisdiction issue, we're talking about federal workers, i.e., if a person works for the federal government, would that be
Yeah,
correct?
you work for the
All right.
federal government,
Okay.
trucking,
So
communications, cable.
yeah. So if you work for
Yes,
CBC, let's say,
yeah, free
even
CBC.
if you were an employee in PEI, the yeah that applies here.
Federal applies to you.
Yeah. What
Yeah,
about for banks if you work for somebody
banks. Yep.
like TD Bank?
Yep. TD Bank is a federal jurisdiction.
So then the Canadian Human Rights Act will comes into play
Yep.
for protection of your
Yep.
rights under
Yep.
that. Okay. Yep.
They've
Okay.
had
So
significant information in decisions recently on Indigenous rights. So there's a lot of
that
stuff.
was actually one thing I have forgotten. Thank you, because obviously First Nation governments come into play there, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that this is where they are. They're under federal jurisdiction. Okay?
Okay. So there is another piece of legislation out there, isn't there? I think
Yeah,
this is the Accessible Canada Act 2019.
yeah. And that's a very different type of thing. It's a codified situation, like how do we set up our via trains, which is under federal jurisdiction? How do we set up our telecommunications network? How do we set up our internet structure, which is all under federal legislation? How do we do that so that things are accessible for people with disabilities? Basically, these things, unfortunately, they do tend to be more physically accessibility. Like, say, if you are hard of hearing or if you are blind, how do you set up a website so that everybody could access your website?
Yeah, it's a
How do you,
very good question because I think a lot of people don't even think about that, do they?
yeah, yeah. How do we set up our train system so that someone who's using a wheelchair, for example, can get on and off a train, and just like anybody else who gets on and off a train, and be able to use the washrooms on the train if
Well,
they need to?
one of the things I would say is that generally speaking, when it comes to things like air travel, people with disabilities usually have there are disabled transit almost from the gate to the plane.
Yeah. And many times once they get on the plane, it becomes a problem.
that that was that was actually my next thought, but I wasn't going to. I didn't know
Like
whether I could
taking
express that
somebody's
one.
wheelchair and putting it into the cargo
Problem,
unit, like
yeah,
really.
the problem here is that a wheelchair does not go down one of the aisles of the plane.
Yeah, exactly. And they have to be very careful with things like that, because if somebody needs it and they have to transport themselves to the washroom, or they need some other assistance, there has to be given that assistance.
Yeah.
Because there was some really big embarrassment recently about that. Somebody's wheelchair got broken, on a plane somewhere. Hey,
Well,
but
yeah.
this is why things happen and why these acts are created, because they don't want these things to happen. So what they do is they set up rules and procedures to try to prevent these things from happening. Okay? Are they effective? They're supposed to be reviewed periodically. Like Ontario has a similar act, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is the AODA. They get their act reviewed every 5 years. The last reviewer who reviewed the act slapped the government around, and before that was David Onley. The review before that, he slapped the government around even bigger and
Yeah.
majorly, because the government hasn't done anything for people with disabilities. We're supposed to be fully accessible by 2025 in Ontario. That
Uh,
that isn't going to happen. So there's a lot of issues around that.
okay.
And we have somebody named David Lepofsky who's keeping an eye on that, and he likes to give this a lot of publicity.
Hmm.
And let people know how the government is not helping people with disabilities.
Okay. So if I were to guess at the percentage of Canadians that have disabilities, and hey, a disability can range from almost anything to, technically, I guess I'm disabled insofar as me walking to my car can be problematic if I have to walk to a kilometer away to go grab my car. Normally, if I'm walking out in the street outside to go grab it, not a problem. I can survive that walk. But, so the percentage of people in Canada with disabilities, I would have said probably would have been 20 to 30%. But
Yeah,
you're probably going to tell me I'm wrong.
some estimate it's 22%, some estimate it's high as 27%.
Okay.
Okay? And I think it's about 30%. There's a
Okay.
lot of people with disabilities who don't admit it. Like they'll put on
Well,
a
that's the other aspect about that because, for example, the question about disabilities, many people don't want to admit there's a problem, that they have a problem.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Then I also think the ranking and how they define disabilities, they say mild, moderate, severe to very severe. I think there's a misnomer in there, because I don't think that necessarily determines a whole lot. because
Yeah.
some people may have a very minor disability and there could be a facial deformity, for example, but the person's
Yeah.
be able to function, but they won't get
Yeah.
hired anymore.
Yeah,
And then,
that facial disability might well just be like pinched nerves in the face
yeah,
that mean that the face doesn't act in the
yeah,
normal way, which might, and without sounding without sounding odd, just might mean that that person's face is frozen on one side, but they can speak normally. They do everything they can do normally.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard of that one before.
Someone with a severe disability, Stephen Hawking is a good example, who had
Yeah.
ALS and he lived for a ripe old age. And he was an astrophysicist and he wrote several books. Okay,
Yeah.
man's a genius. And this guy was very productive and very wealthy. Okay,
Yeah.
he was a professor and he had a lot of different things. Okay, so there's a lot of different
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
variances.
Yeah.
So I don't like
Absolutely.
ranking things like that, that this is makes it therefore you have a more better chance of getting
Well,
employment if you got a mild or moderate disability than if you had a severe or very and
okay.
how do
So
you determine, like, I have certain types of disabilities, but there are certain impacts that these disabilities have on me that cost me a lot of money. And for other
so
people, they might have a disability that doesn't cost them that much money, but it causes them other grief.
yeah, yeah.
Okay?
Okay, so Stephen Hawking, the Stephen Hawking example, he's probably, and sadly he's no longer with us,
Hmm.
but he's probably the world's most famous disabled person,
Absolutely. Yeah,
right?
his name is Terry. What's his name? Fox, Terry Fox.
Terry Fox.
And
Yeah, but Terry Fox is known well in Canada, but not so widely known outside of Canada.
yeah, there's a number of people who've been very, very good, and they've contributed a lot. And so, many of them have
But
become Paralympians,
was
where
there
they,
was one There was one I also remember, but I can't remember his. I think it's Prefontaine. I think he's the one who has the metal disability leg.
hmm,
It's a South African. I'm pretty sure that's the name, Prefontaine.
yeah,
He's the inventor of that disability leg, the kind of spring leg.
hmm,
Um, but yeah, there aren't that many, world famous disabled people, and that's an important aspect. Okay,
yeah. And
so
it's very important to realize that a lot of these people who got up that far had a whole lot of support given to
yeah,
them, whether it's family, whether it's their community, whether it's where they worked. Some people get disabled later in their life, and then they already have a workplace or another place around them that, hey, okay, Joe, you're going to do okay because we're backing you. And they
yeah,
do. Okay. And
yeah.
that's fine. That's great. And I wish more
Okay.
workplaces were like that.
Okay, let's have a look at this. So we came across this headline today. What we can learn from the 30% of Americans who don't drive. Now, I was when you sent this to me earlier on, or yesterday actually, in relation to the program for this morning we were talking about with Talking Niagara. I was surprised that it was as high as 30% of people don't drive, of Americans don't drive. And clearly, when we bring statistics like this about America, it's typically that we understand that maybe Canadian statistics haven't been measured, but they're likely to be in the same range. And that's why when we paint pictures like this, we do it because there's more research, because there are more numbers of people in America. And
And it's even
well,
higher in urban areas. Like if you
yeah,
go to Toronto, for example,
well,
maybe a
yeah,
ton more people don't drive. Like I
and
would say
that's
it's
not. If
60.
you're living in Toronto, the larger number of people who don't drive has got nothing to do with the percentage of people who are disabled.
No, no, it has to do with the people who are pissed off because they don't want to drive a car around Toronto and pay to
Would
park.
you, would you really want to drive a car 13 and a half blocks, and only to find that the nearest parking is 13 and a half blocks back that way?
Yep, exactly. That's why a lot of people in Toronto don't drive.
Yeah.
I know people who are very high level positions in government, in corporate Canada, very places who do not even have a driver's license.
Mm.
And I remember talking to one of them one time and I asked him, I said, how do you get a ride without a license? He says, well, I live in Toronto, born and raised. And I said, but how do you do things like get groceries, go travel, get out of town, get things? He says, well, there's cars, buses, taxis, planes, that sort of thing. These people are, yeah, because they've lived in Toronto. They don't know what it's like to live in a place like, say, Niagara Falls, or in a place like Muskoka or North Bay, or someplace where I would say a good portion of people drive.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's a whole heap different. You see, Toronto, comparing Toronto, okay, there's 2.5 million people in Toronto, whereas there's 450,000 people in Niagara. But Toronto is a whole heap different because it's more conglomerate, and there's more buses, subways, and the like. Now, okay, I will also make the point that, hey, the numbers of subways in central Toronto compared to places like London, Paris, Berlin, and the like is nothing compared
And
to
they
some of
are
the
putting
European
more
cities.
and there's more political pressure too to put more subways, buses, etc. in Toronto than there
Yeah.
would around, say, Hamilton or here. Although Hamilton is starting to improve quite a bit too.
Yeah, and Hamilton's another comparator because they're about 500. They're just over the 500,000 mark, whereas Niagara's in the 450 to 500,000 mark. So we're just a tag behind Hamilton, but Hamilton actually has much more transit than does Niagara, and that transit there's a large amount of transit that does get people into work in the central corridor of Hamilton.
Yeah. And they actually work on it, and they do look at it so that it is usable transit. So when you're planning transit, you have to plan it for transit that could be used.
Yeah,
Okay, that it's not going to be transit
but of
that
course,
for people who are, I guess, captive audience or captive users. Okay, that people who have to use transit, like your students, like your older
yeah,
people, that sort of
yeah,
thing. You have to have
and
transit for commuters. You have to have transit for people who need to get places from one place to another, or just want a social life. You have to have transit.
and again, this figure we're seeing in front of us, about 30% of Americans who don't drive, you could go to probably if you went to some semi-rural area in North Dakota, for example, you'd probably find the numbers of drivers there will be somewhat similar to the numbers of drivers in the Niagara region, i.e., you've got to have more. You've got to, in order to get around, you've got to use a car because there's no public transit.
And
and
that's why
and
a
the
lot of
same
people
would
with
probably be
disabilities can't
true
live.
in northern Ontario, somewhere like Kenora,
Hmm.
where there might well be less buses.
That's why a lot of people with disabilities start moving to urban areas. They can't afford to live in a rural area because it's
Yeah,
very expensive for them to get around.
yeah. So in terms of um, in terms of what can we learn from these people, that's the important point about this. What can we learn from those people who don't drive?
I think that they need to look at this as being a privileged system that they have set up, and that the world is set up only for people who drive. It's not set up even for people who bike, not even set
Yeah,
up for people who walk, okay? Let alone set up for wheelchairs or other types of modes of transportation.
yeah.
We have to have a multimodal system. Like, I'm not saying let's get rid of all the cars, okay? Because
Oh, of course. Yeah.
even if we had a 100% perfect transit system in our area, you'll still have a percentage of people who will be stubborn and want to drive.
Well, actually, and even if you had 100% perfect transit system in our area, there'd be, uh, I'd be on the route where there's no convenient bus. It takes me 45 minutes to get to a bus. Um, you know, uh, and then another hour and a half from there in order to get to my
Yeah,
destination, when I've gotten to my destination in 15 and a half minutes.
yeah. So I mean, this has to be looked at if
Yeah.
you're looking at trying to improve transit. Target the target the drivers who may not want to drive 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like not every driver is going to say, okay, I'm going to hop on the bus and only use the bus. But if you're going to have them, and attract them so that they will take it one at a time, maybe give up one of the cars and maybe one of the people will go to work by transit. So these are things that could be done because I've seen this happen. Kitchener Waterloo when they've improved their transit network. I've talked to some of the
Yeah,
people from there and they were telling me that yeah, they were able to sell one of their cars
yeah.
and they were able to use transit to get wherever they needed to go and just use the car if they had to get out of town or go visit Muskoka or something like that. So I mean,
Well,
I think,
one always has to get to one's cottage.
oh yeah, they have to get to cottage. I don't have a cottage. I don't think I'll ever have one, but I'm sure that some people do, and they still want to go. So
Yeah. And
okay.
the point about what you were just saying anyway is any changes like that doesn't mean to say, you see, even in Toronto, there are many households that actually own a car that probably hardly ever use the car.
Yeah.
What happens is if they're going away to Muskoka at the weekend, at the summer holidays or something, that's when they drive the car,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Or they use a zip car or various types of like Uber
Well,
cars where they
those are options as well, of course.
yeah, and it's
Those
very
those
widely
are all options.
widely done in Toronto with community cars. And it's very interesting how they have it. It's like an auto co-op, hey, auto share. So there's a
Yeah,
lot of very different, unique situations in Toronto
but
that we don't see as much here.
but again, in relation to the what we can learn from the 30% of Americans who don't drive, that's not necessarily giving better options for disabled people, is it?
No, no. What it is that people with disabilities, over 50% of people with disabilities cannot drive as a result of their disability or as a result of because they cannot afford the handicap adaptations to their car.
Yeah, I was going to say handicap adaptations are key things, and those handicap adaptations can be as small as just a knob on a steering wheel that enables a person to drive, a person who's not got two hands to drive with their one hand. And I've got a friend who's got one of those
Yeah,
um,
I knew a quad
to
drove,
to
and he had
button
you should see the
to
way his vehicle was all set up. And he
yeah,
goes on, he just flicks something, and the door opens, he gets on, he gets right into the driver's seat, and then he straps himself down and gets something, and it's very secure. And
yeah.
then he starts just driving around. It's very interesting watching that. But but this guy was able to get that money somehow, and he was able to
So
get
of course in that scenario, you do have disabled people who can drive,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, because he
And
already had his
that's
driver's
an
license and
important
he got into some
aspect.
kind of accident or something,
Yeah,
and maybe his insurance company gave him some money to set up his vehicle. Eh?
yeah,
But there's a lot of people who cannot drive because of their
yeah,
disability. There was a
yeah,
list of disabilities that I had a list of over 85 different types of disabilities that could impact on your ability to drive. And there are some that can impact on it. Some of them they have to determine. Like if you're going blind and you're legally blind, for example, they have to yank your license.
yeah,
If you're having seizures, they have to yank your license.
yeah.
Alcoholism, they have to yank your license. There's other things too that there is a discretion.
And for example, alcoholism and yanking a license isn't necessary. Well, it might be classified as disability, but again, not necessarily a disability.
Yeah, it depends on the
Yeah,
situation. What
yeah.
happens with these people is when we have driving as a quote unquote privileged, we're saying that it's privileged to hold a higher paying job. It's privileged to have a social life. It's
Well,
privileged to be able to get around you.
that's an in- so That's an interesting question you raised there, because and that actually leads on to a whole heap of other things. So, for example, if you're talking about a corporate executive who's got a $250,000 job, who becomes disabled, you know, uh, they have an accident. They have an accident. the accident means that they're no longer able to walk around. They've now lost a leg, right? It doesn't mean to say their brain hasn't been affected.
Absolutely. I mean, there's another fellow I know, he had a recent amputation of his leg. He still
Yeah,
runs his business. He probably doesn't do as much physical work in his business, but he can manage it. He
yeah.
can, I think he probably got something to help him drive in his vehicle, but he'll go to the different sites and he'll work with the people that he does pay to do the work.
Well, and again, that's the kind of thing where an adaptation that you can accelerate and decelerate
Yeah,
off your steering wheel could easily be done.
yeah. And he does fine. And he's got a prosthetic, walks around with a prosthetic, and you'll never know it because, the way
Yeah.
they make prostheses nowadays, but the thing is, that's fine. People go through these things. He had an accident. That's how he got. And then he had some really bad infection and they had to do that.
Yeah.
When this happens to people, like, and I love his attitude. He says, no, I'm just going to carry on. I'm going to continue run my business. Hey,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Another quick question, and we'll deal with this one quickly. Does our car dependency make healthcare access harder for the disabled?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because if you can't get to your doctor's office or specialists, and they're at a distance and you don't drive, okay, you're going to either get a cab there.
And
That's going to cost you a lot of money. Like your firstborn was already given away the last time, so now you have to go after your secondborn and maybe
well,
thirdborn.
I'm gonna be the jerk. Well, what do you mean you can't get to? What do you mean you can't get to your doctor's appointment? Just get another doctor around the corner from you.
Yeah, how many Canadians don't have family doctors? There's 6 million of us.
That is actually that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked
I'm
that.
gonna just ditch my family doctor that I do have and I've known for years and years, and then to get somebody that I might not know or may not be able to get another family doctor.
Yeah,
A lot of
and
people
the
are
point
getting walk-in
and the
clinics.
and the point, of course, being that if you've got if you've got a specialist appointment and hey, that specialist appointment is in. I'm just going to pick an awkward. Is in Windsor,
Hmm.
right? Well, for me, that basically just means I'm going to hop in the car and I'll probably drive the night before in order to make sure I'm going to get there on time for the 9 o'clock appointment. Not going to try and get up at 7 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning and do it madcap. I'm going to drive there
Hmm.
really early. But again, for the disabled person who's living in my house, doing the same appointment, well, probably they're going to have to start a week earlier, aren't they? Start traveling a week earlier, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And this is very hard for people with disabilities, and they have to get onto buses, which may or may not be accessible. They take trips that may or may not be accessible, depending on the type of disability they have. And
Well,
it takes
yeah,
up a lot of time. What people without disabilities don't understand is that time has a price on it.
yeah.
Okay?
Well, that
You can
actually
take
is
a
a
bus
very good.
and take an hour and a half to get somewhere. People say, well, you can just take the bus to go somewhere. But an hour and a half of your time of your day, when your time is money, is a waste of time.
Well,
Right?
actually, let's talk about that particular one. So, if I'm driving to Windsor from here in the Niagara region, it's probably going to take me 4 to 5 hours.
Yeah.
Right, Windsor, Ontario. If I'm going to go to Windsor, Ontario by bus, right? So I'm going to get on the Coach Canada or Greyhound, and I'm going to travel
Flip.
firstly to Toronto. Secondly, I'm going to get another bus that goes from Toronto to Windsor. So essentially, that's going to take me probably 2 to 3 hours to get to Toronto from Niagara. Then it's going to take me probably another 4 to 5 hours to get to Windsor.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about a
And
day's travel.
what it is a disrespect for the time of the person with the disability. When people who don't have the disability and are able to drive, their time is valuable and valued, which
Yeah.
is something a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah.
Right? That's why something has to be done in terms of
And
equality.
yeah. And of course, the answer to the next question about is our car obsessed culture especially hard on disabled people, the answer to that one is absolutely yes.
Yeah. Like in Niagara region, if you don't drive, you basically don't work. Okay, unless you're willing
That's
to work at a
yeah, that's a problem.
burger flipping or whatever. Okay,
Yeah,
where they hire mostly people who are just warm bodies. Okay.
yeah.
But if you want to get
Well,
a job that's really matching your career goals and so forth, every single job ad, and I did this back in the early 2000s, 800 job ads over a period of 6 years. Every single one of them that perhaps can get people into a career or a good career path must have a G license and a daily access to a vehicle.
yeah.
And that discriminates against a lot of people, not just non
Okay.
drivers, but also people who may drive but may not have the money to get their own car. And
Okay.
poor
So
people too.
don't tell me nobody's taken that one to the HRTO.
I did.
And
Well, the problem is taking something like that to the HRTO, who are you going to sue? Okay, this is the problem. Okay, because you have to have some kind of policy in place to do things. Okay, like back there, well, we ended up with regional transit here in Niagara because of a lot of actions I took back in 2006 and leading after 2010. Okay, and this was very well publicized in our local
and
papers.
and of course, when I use that example about Coach Canada going to, and I'm not picking on Coach Canada at all. Just let me make that clear. So picking on and talking about Coach Canada and taking you to Toronto, then taking you
Mhm.
to Windsor. That's probably the most effective route that they could do. Now, could there be is there a faster route? Potentially, yes. The potential is that you could go on to via rail, for example, if you once you got into downtown Toronto, you can transfer over to via rail and get there much quicker.
Yeah, exactly. There's different options, but there has to be some kind of coordination, connection, and to assist with these different options into so that people with disabilities aren't feeling like their time is being disrespected. And
Yeah,
not only their time in many cases, but also their whole body and accessibility, like that poor guy on the plane who had his wheelchair busted. Okay.
yeah. The plane is another issue entirely, but
Exactly. I
yeah,
don't know what happened or where he was going or where he thought he was going to go, but certainly the airline didn't agree with him.
yeah,
But this is the kind of stuff with the car obsessed culture, they have to get out of that. I'm not saying that people don't drive, people have to get into a thing where there's true meaningful alternatives. I do know in the UK for a while they had where people who had to use something like Uber or something to get around because they worked and to get there on time, they were given subsidies. Okay? Just give them enough subsidy that they would be paying just as much as somebody who drives to get to the same place. Okay? People are always complaining about gas prices. It costs way more for a person with a disability to get around
yeah.
on an equitable
And
basis.
and okay, so the other question there then also becomes one of, well, you can get the bus.
Yeah, but sometimes buses are too far away for some people. They can't walk to a bus stop. Sometimes it's wintertime. The bus stop is inaccessible. And sometimes the buses only come every hour. And there's a lot of reasons why. And then there's some people who are neurodivergent. They don't understand maps and bus
Yeah.
schedules. They can't figure
Okay.
it out. I had to go and had to teach people different things. And, it's very hard for some people to understand things. Just simple, like, how do I get home from Brock? Things like that. And I had to deal with people like that. And there are people in the world that just can't do it. And you need to be the world has to start accommodating people. You see, the world is so used to institutionalizing and shutting away people with disabilities that people didn't want to see them. Even our own Doug Ford said at one time that he was shocked that autistic people were able to leave this group home and go out into the community each day. He was shocked that these
Why
people were
would you
not out.
be?
And he
Why
said
would you be shocked with that?
that they said that there seemed to be that he was there was a shock that he was getting in. Like, I don't know why he said that, and it was I guess the location of the home. I guess he was upset about that people were going and maybe people were complaining. But this is a typical NIMBY, okay? And the thing is, this was a group home that where these people were living. They lived fairly independently, but they still stayed in the group home, okay, because they had to have some supervision. But they were able to go out shopping, go out visit friends, go out do different things, during the daytime. But I guess people get shocked that these people with disabilities are not institutionalized and locked up 24/7. And even during the pandemic, I've
No
heard
question about people.
some very discouraging statements during the pandemic, such as
The
people
whole question, though, about
maybe
people being
disabled people should stay home if they don't want to get COVID.
Yeah, the whole question about people being locked up and institutionalized, we've changed our whole way of thinking, because if we wind the clock back to the 50s, you'd have been institutionalized because somebody thought you were um, not competent in the mind, or
Men used to lock up their wives and commit them to mental health facilities
yes,
for
yeah,
so-called
exactly.
hysteria.
Yeah,
The history of that is interesting too.
yeah. Well, that's another subject entirely.
Exactly. I would love to
Yeah.
show you the psychiatric paradox sometime.
Well, there is another aspect over here that's an important one, is discrimination for disabled people living with others, because particularly we hear these stories all the time. ODSP recipients essentially not in a relationship and can't enter in a relationship because as soon as they do, any money they earn is gone.
Yeah.
And you were talking about earlier on.
Eugenics, the days
Yeah.
of eugenics, where they just didn't think people with disabilities had any sexual preferences or any interest or can't even get into a romantic relationship. After all, who would want to fall in love with some guy in a wheelchair? So
Yeah.
this kind of thinking still exists today. And then what they do is all the policies and everything enable that way of thinking.
But
So
again, we were talking earlier on about two people that had a reasonable income, and one of them becomes disabled because of something that happens to them. Essentially, there's a problem. We have a problem there insofar as you got two people who are earning $60,000 salaries, just to be equal amongst the two. One of them loses their ability to work because of a car accident, right? They may have the mind to be able to go out to work, there, etc., etc. But the question then becomes one of, they end up on ODSP, or some other form of benefit, and that then becomes a disadvantage to the relationship.
yeah, they wouldn't be getting ODSP because if the other partner makes
Well, quite.
60,000, they would not be getting it. If they get 35,000, they wouldn't be getting it. I mean, this is where a lot of problems are. What it does, it legislates poverty for that family. So what that does, it creates a lot of divorces, creates a lot of
Yeah.
domestic violence. It generates a lot of issues that wouldn't occur if people were able to be financially self-sufficient. And
Yeah.
right now we have a housing crisis. Everybody talks about, oh God, we got so many, we need so much housing to be built. If people could live together, that's two houses can now be one house. Two people could live together. And then you have an extra house that somebody else could live in. Okay? Right now, we have this problem where people with disabilities are not allowed to live with somebody. Because remember, people with disabilities, oh, we can't imagine them actually getting sexually involved or getting romantically involved with somebody else. Oh, no, we can't. That has to stop.
Well, that actually is discriminatory, because in fact, you know, if you think about the fact that
They
we,
sterilized people for the same reason. They sterilized people all the way up to 1973 when the last eugenics program in Alberta shut down.
yeah, well,
Okay? That was lawsuit was challenged, and then of course Alberta tried to use Section 33 to get out of the charter on that one, but they had to backtrack when everybody raised uproar about it.
well, the whole point is that on the one hand, we have a government that likes to see people very often likes to see people in committed relationships. We have a society that generally scorns upon people who get divorced.
Hmm.
And even though it's an increasing factor in our society, it's no doubt that governments and generally society as a whole still scorn people who get divorced. Yet it's the only thing you can do if you're disabled.
Right? And this is what happens. People have divorced for this very reason because they
Yeah,
cannot be financial. I've had clients in the last several years where I've had one living with a man who made $80,000 a year. She had a whole overpayment. She was not even living with him at the time, but they
yeah,
took her money away from her because they kept saying she was living with him. And she was in a marriage-like relationship. And then she had this overpayment. And then when she did live with him and she got married to him, then he started becoming financially abusive. He made 80,000. I don't remember his occupation particularly, but nevertheless, he never gave her any money to, like, can't get money
yeah,
for coffee, can't go money to get feminine products, can't get money for anything. So it was starting to become abusive.
yeah.
And then she was in a situation where she was forced to separate from him, go back to live with her mother, who was equally abusive, but in another way, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
This kind of thing, happens with disability people. Like, in fact, when you look at the stats, the statistics of people with disabilities, 90% of them are individual, single people living alone. And it's fraud if you're living with somebody and you don't tell disability. It's fraud. But however, if you're not on disability,
Well,
oh, you can say, hey, I've got my new boyfriend and all that stuff.
yeah. I was going to say,
Congratulations.
yeah.
And
I
but
was going to say,
however, if you're disabled, oh, you have to hide your relationship. And that has to stop because what that does, it criminalizes relationships,
yeah.
criminalizes people with disabilities.
And that's a big problem in my mind, because the thing is that when you've got, you know, um, putting aside whatever the type of relationship is, that hey, whether you are when you're in a relationship, whether you want to be public about it, private about it, or any way in between, is entirely up to you. Or straight,
It,
gay,
it
whatever.
shouldn't matter
I don't
whether
care, and
if
it
you
shouldn't
qualify
matter
for
to anybody.
ODSP, just give it to you. It shouldn't matter. It should be up to your
Yeah.
ability to work. And then, of course, the earnings exemption should be much higher, and you should be able to make an average wage before you
Well,
start
you
that.
see that going back to that example that we used before about two people who were on 60,000, essentially one becomes disabled, and essentially they were on a family salary of 120,000.
Yeah,
All right. They were also on family expenses of 100, based upon 120,000.
yeah,
Now,
what they're used to. Yeah,
because we're not being critical about what people are doing, but people spend money based upon their income, right? So essentially
now
the
you want to know
money.
who's homeless out there? Ask them what their income source is.
Yeah, yeah.
I
and
think people should know this.
and
And
the
I think that this is what we're spending money on. We're spending $120,000 a year to keep each person homeless.
Well, the other question in relation to what I was just saying about that disabled family, so that they had 120,000 combined salary. Now one's become disabled. They only have 60,000 combined salary,
Yep. And
right?
that
Because
60,000 has to
that's
go
gone.
now for two people and also to cover the person's health care expenses.
Yes.
It's not covered by their workplace plan if they have one.
Yep. Oh
And they
yeah.
have to pay for wheelchairs, they have to pay for disability medications, everything else that is not covered by OHIP. And
Yeah.
this is I don't think that this is well thought out. There are some positives where ODSP has done things where there is where people could get health care benefits even if they're working full time but not on the income part. They can get that continually if their workplace doesn't provide it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if there's any limits if they get married to somebody and then their income goes way up. I don't know. But I think that this stuff, I think that there should be something offered to everybody. I don't know. It's just, to me, I think there's so much injustices. But when you're looking at people with disabilities, the idea of somebody not being able to work, okay, because of their disability, for example, if any of you out there are not able to work and you cannot go out and earn an income, where we have a society that's built on the whole idea that you have to be self-sufficient to be considered a person, to be respected, to be valued. I think that there's something there that has to change.
Yeah.
We all go around and say, okay, I'm managing partner of Invictus Legal, your partner of Invictus Legal. Other people come to me and said, okay, I'm a tradesman, I'm a carpenter, that sort of thing. Okay. People with disabilities who are not able to work, they don't feel like they're a full person. They don't feel like they're a full citizen. And then when they get things like this piled on them, they feel even less of a full citizen.
Okay, so just want to say to you, Dwight Lamont is saying very interesting subject matter tonight. So he said hi there, Robert and Angela, but he really meant Peter and Angela.
Yes, yes.
Right?
Peter
He
and
apologized. And he
oh yeah,
apologized
sorry,
afterwards.
not
Right?
Robert. Peter, sorry.
So Dwight, yeah, we've tried. We were thinking we didn't have actually something planned, and because we'd done Talking Niagara this morning, Angela made the suggestion this afternoon. Well, we still had some things we didn't discuss this morning about disability. Why don't we talk about that?
And this was very important. Like Mike Kurtzman put a lot of stuff in about WSIB, which is also another
Another
shoehorn
area. Yeah.
coffin for people with disabilities and their rights, particularly those that are injured at work. And then they get told, like after they break their arm or something, they have to return to work in a week when everybody else can stay at home and get unemployment enjoyment for 6 weeks while they recover because they just been in a skiing accident. So they come back to work after they're truly recovered. But no, they can't do this. If you're on WSIB, you got to come back to work, even though you're on opioids and everything else, and you got to you've got to pay this. You got to type with your left hand instead of your right hand, like this kind of stuff. And then, or you get put into some room in front of all your coworkers where you're sitting there shredding paper all day.
Yeah, shredding paper when you've just got a crushed hand. That's
Yes, exactly. I've had a case like that where he was made to shred paper. It went all the way to WSIAT, and they determined that this was not a legitimate occupation. For what they call it, suitable employment or self-employment benefit. Yeah.
And there's a lot of, okay, so based upon what we've been talking about to date, there's a lot of challenges with anybody who's got a disability. I said, I said it the wrong way, but hey, and there are what I meant to say, there are a lot of legal challenges in terms of disability, and the question and find out what your rights are. And
yes, sometimes you can try to get onto disability. There's a lot of people who are sitting on Ontario Works now who should be on ODSP. Or people who are trying to get long-term disability, or people who are trying to get CPP disability benefits.
Yeah.
CPP doesn't have the marriage penalty, but they don't have the drug benefits either. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that people need to know. I help people secure various types of disability benefits, including WSIB, CPP, OW, ODSP. We work on these things and we try to problem solve within each of these contexts. But it's frustrating when I see this and then how the system works. It works against itself.
Yep.
There's a policy analyst that I know. His name's John Stapleton. He has written quite a bit about how these types of policies cannibalize progress for a person to get back on their feet.
Yep.
And so I think that some of the work that he has written is really good. Just look him up, and it's called Open Policy. He has an
Okay.
open policy website.
All right. I think we can leave it at that point. The challenge here is we've not actually solved any issues, but we've kind of brought up a whole heap of issues. And we've talked primarily today more from the quasi-political viewpoint than from the legal viewpoint. But
Yep.
there were issues that people need to be aware of, and they could
I think
affect
that if
you.
there's any lawyers out there listening who love doing constitutional challenges, I would welcome them to call the office and then see what we can do to challenge some of these issues.
Yeah.
Because there are people who are suffering, and I could probably get them easily to probably petition 500 of them easily and do a class action, like it's really, really something that people are talking about. They didn't start talking about a lot of these things until recently.
After all, she met Erin Brockovich.
Yes, I did.
Okay. So if you need to contact Invictus Legal, you can do so on 905-688-5598. Or you can email Angela at angela@weareinvictus.legal or me at peter@weareinvictus.legal. Our website is https://weareinvictus.legal. And this only leaves us really now to Angela's favorite part.
Yes, it's always my waiver. Okay. What you've heard on Spin Legal is not legal advice, either in this episode or any of our other previous episodes. That you cannot take what we say, hey, that sounds like me. I wonder what they're saying, if this is something I could do. No, it isn't. It's just giving some discussion about legal topics that people are curious about. If you need legal advice of your own and you need to look at what your situation is, then please contact a paralegal or a lawyer. We would really like you to contact us, but you don't necessarily have to, but you can contact us. And then the other thing too is, if you like us to talk about a topic and to cover a topic that we haven't covered yet, or if you'd like to have some details that Willie, that you would like to see some details of something discussed, do not hesitate to put in the comment sections or to send an email or some other text to us that you would like us to talk about a particular topic, and we'd be happy to consider it.
All right. Well, I think with that, we can kind of wish everybody a good night and hope that they are going to enjoy themselves, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for coming tonight, for those who have watched us and lent us your comments.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.